"Don't sign that deal," a small voice said from the back of the glass-walled conference room. And for half a second, everything inside Carter Tower seemed to forget how to breathe. The words were not loud, yet they cut through the polished silence like a crack in expensive marble. William Carter paused mid-motion, his pen hovering just above the signature line of a document that represented nearly $2 billion in international expansion agreements. Around him, the board members of Carter Global Exchange shifted in their seats, surprised by the interruption. Daniel Mercer, standing just behind the legal counsel's table, let out a soft, dismissive laugh as if the moment itself were an inconvenience. Near the entrance, a small girl stepped forward, her sneakers quiet against the reflective floor, her eyes locked on the contract in William's hands. Ava Johnson was 8 years old, but her gaze carried the kind of focus that made adults instinctively straighten their posture when she spoke. "Sir," she said again, softer this time but steady, "you can't sign that." A brief silence followed, heavy and uncomfortable, like the room itself was deciding whether to take her seriously. William finally lowered his pen slightly, his brows tightening in confusion rather than anger. "Who let a child into this meeting?" one board member whispered under his breath. Daniel Mercer immediately raised his hands in a calming gesture, stepping forward with a rehearsed smile. "This is inappropriate," he said smoothly. "Security should remove her. We are in the middle of a formal acquisition." Ava did not move back. She pointed instead at the thick stack of documents on the table, her finger stopping just above a section highlighted in faint gray ink. "That clause," she said, "it reroutes all offshore assets within 90 days. Not to Carter Global, but to Mercer Holdings." A few heads turned instinctively toward Daniel. The smile on his face did not disappear, but something behind it tightened. William Carter glanced down at the page, his eyes narrowing as he traced the section she indicated. The language was dense, deliberately structured, the kind of legal wording designed to hide intent behind complexity. "That's not possible," William said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. Daniel stepped closer, his tone still controlled, but sharper now. "She's guessing. Children hear words like assets and think they understand business." Ava reached into her small backpack and pulled out a thin tablet, unlocking it with quick precision. The screen lit up, displaying a live financial feed that none of the executives had seen before. Numbers moved in real time. Transactions, transfers, confirmations. Lines of capital shifting between accounts that were supposed to be secure until final approval. "I'm not guessing," she said. "I saw the system sync an hour ago. I followed the pattern. It's already moving." A ripple of unease spread through the room. William Carter's expression changed subtly, the skepticism in his eyes giving way to calculation. He had built his empire on reading patterns, on recognizing when numbers told a different story than words. And what he was seeing now did not align with what he had been told. Daniel Mercer's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "This is ridiculous," he said, but his voice carried less confidence than before. Ava took another step forward, stopping just short of the table. "If you sign it," she said, looking directly at William, "you won't be expanding your company. You'll be handing it over without knowing it." The room fell into a deeper silence, the kind that presses against the ears. Outside the glass walls, New York continued its usual rhythm. Taxi horns faint in the distance, helicopters tracing invisible paths above the skyline. But inside, time felt suspended. William Carter slowly lowered the pen completely, placing it down beside the contract. "How did you get access to this information?" he asked. Ava hesitated for the first time, just briefly, then replied, "Because someone left the door open where they thought no one small enough would notice." Daniel gave a short laugh, but it sounded forced now. "This is insane. You're letting a child interrupt a multi-billion-dollar agreement based on what? A tablet and imagination." William did not answer immediately. His eyes stayed on the document, then shifted to Ava, studying her expression with increasing focus. She was not pleading. She was not afraid. She was waiting. Before he could speak again, a faint vibration echoed through the room, subtle at first, then multiplied as phones across the table lit up simultaneously. One executive picked up his device, then another. The color in their faces changed almost in sync. "Sir," one of them said quietly to William, "you need to see this." William reached for his phone. The screen displayed a notification from internal compliance systems. Unauthorized financial routing detected. Multiple accounts flagged. Transfer protocol initiated. His expression hardened instantly. Daniel Mercer took a step back, his earlier confidence beginning to fracture at the edges. Ava did not look at the phones. She only looked at William. "They don't need you to sign it anymore," she said softly. "They just needed you to be in the room when it looked like you agreed." A heavy pause followed, one that seemed to stretch beyond the walls of the conference room itself. Then, in the distance, faint at first, almost indistinguishable from the city noise, sirens began to rise. Not rushed, not chaotic, controlled, approaching. William Carter turned his head slightly toward the sound, his expression unreadable now, caught between realization and disbelief. Daniel Mercer opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The elevator chime echoed faintly outside the boardroom doors. Footsteps followed, measured, deliberate, unmistakably official. Ava exhaled once, quietly, as if she had been holding that moment in place for a long time. The doors at the far end of the room began to unlock. The moment the elevator chime echoed outside the glass boardroom doors, the atmosphere inside shifted in a way that no one could ignore. The faint mechanical sound of locks disengaging felt louder than any voice in the room. William Carter remained still, his hand resting near the edge of the table where the contract lay untouched, his eyes fixed on the doors as if waiting for reality to fully define itself. Ava Johnson stood slightly behind him now, small in frame, but steady in presence, her gaze not on the doors but on Daniel Mercer, who had taken one step back without realizing it. The board members exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier confidence replaced by cautious silence. When the doors finally opened, the first figure to enter was a man in a dark suit, followed by two more, each carrying themselves with the calm precision of official authority. The lead agent's badge caught the overhead light just long enough to confirm what the room already suspected. Special Agent Mark Collins scanned the room once, his expression neutral but focused, before his eyes landed on the table. "Good afternoon," he said evenly. "William Carter, we need you to step away from the contract." The words were not loud, but they carried a finality that made the air feel heavier. William did not move immediately. His eyes shifted briefly to Daniel Mercer, who now stood too still, his earlier composure beginning to unravel in subtle fragments. "On what grounds?" William asked, his voice controlled but sharpened by confusion. Agent Collins stepped forward, holding a thin folder. "We are acting on verified evidence of unauthorized financial routing, falsified acquisition terms, and active diversion of corporate assets." A quiet murmur spread across the board members. One of them instinctively pushed his chair back slightly. Daniel Mercer let out a short laugh, but it lacked conviction. "This is absurd," he said quickly. "There must be a misunderstanding. This is a standard acquisition review." Ava Johnson took a small step forward, her voice calm but clear. "There is no misunderstanding." Every head in the room turned toward her again. Agent Collins glanced down at her briefly, then back at William. "We were alerted ahead of time by a whistleblower with documented tracking of the transaction pattern," he said. William's expression changed slightly at that word, and his gaze shifted back to Ava. For the first time, the room seemed to fully register her presence not as interruption, but as origin. "You," William said quietly, "reported this." Ava nodded once. "I did not report everything. I only confirmed what was already happening." Daniel Mercer took another step back, his hand brushing the edge of the table as if grounding himself. "A child cannot possibly understand corporate transaction systems," he said, voice rising slightly now. "This is being manipulated." Agent Collins opened the folder and placed a document on the table, sliding it forward. "These are synchronized transfers initiated from your linked accounts over the past 40 minutes. The timing corresponds exactly with the moment the contract was prepared for signature." The silence that followed was different from before. It was not anticipation anymore. It was recognition. William Carter slowly picked up the document, his eyes scanning line after line, the structure of the financial movement revealing a pattern that no longer felt abstract. It was deliberate, calculated. He lowered the paper slightly. "Explain the structure," he said quietly, not to Daniel, but to the agents. Agent Collins gestured slightly toward one of his team members, who stepped forward with a tablet displaying a visual map of transactions. "The routing begins here," he said, pointing to a highlighted node, then splits across 3 intermediary accounts before consolidating offshore. "The structure is designed to appear as internal restructuring until final authorization locks it permanently." William Carter's jaw tightened subtly as the diagram expanded. It was not just fraud. It was architecture. Daniel Mercer finally spoke again, his tone sharper now. "You are all reacting to a system anomaly. This will be resolved internally. There is no criminal intent here." Ava looked at him directly. "Intent does not matter when the outcome is already in motion," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it carried through the room in a way that made even the board members stop shifting in their seats. William Carter looked at her again, this time longer, as if trying to understand not just what she knew, but how she knew it. "How did you see this before anyone else?" he asked. Ava hesitated briefly, then answered, "Because I was not looking at what was being said. I was looking at what was moving when no one was paying attention." Agent Collins closed the folder slightly. "At this point, Mr. Carter, we advise full suspension of the agreement pending investigation." William nodded slowly, his gaze dropping once more to the contract on the table. The pen he had placed down earlier still lay beside it, untouched, a small object that now felt heavier than before. Outside the glass walls, the city continued in motion, unaware of the shift taking place in this room. Inside, everything had narrowed to a single point of realization. Daniel Mercer straightened slightly, attempting one final composure. "William, you know me," he said, softer now, almost pleading. But William did not respond immediately. His attention remained fixed on the evidence, the pattern, the structure, the inevitability of what had already begun before any signature could be made. Finally, he spoke. "No," he said quietly. "I thought I did." The words landed without force, but they changed the air completely. Ava lowered her gaze for the first time, not in defeat, but in quiet resolution. Agent Collins signaled subtly, and the team moved with coordinated calm. Daniel Mercer stood frozen for a moment longer, as if waiting for the moment to reverse itself, but it did not come. The room that had once been built for negotiation had become something else entirely, a place where decisions had already been made long before anyone arrived. And in the center of it, a child who had been ignored for being too small to matter stood as the only reason the silence now meant something different. The moment the legal folder closed in Agent Mark Collins' hand, the atmosphere inside the conference room shifted again, not into relief, but into a heavier kind of uncertainty, as if the air itself had not yet decided whether the danger was fully contained. William Carter stood still near the table, his eyes fixed on the contract that had started everything, though it now felt like a relic of a timeline that had already broken apart. Ava Johnson remained in the same place she had been since the agents arrived, her small hands resting lightly on the strap of her backpack, her expression calm but distant, as if she was no longer reacting to what was happening in real time, but confirming what she had already seen unfold in pieces long. Before anyone else understood it, Daniel Mercer was no longer speaking. He stood slightly apart from the others, his posture rigid, his gaze moving between the agents and the table in short, controlled shifts, as if searching for an exit that no longer existed in the same form it had minutes earlier. One of the board members finally broke the silence, his voice careful and uncertain. "So what happens now?" he asked. Agent Collins turned slightly, addressing the room without urgency, but with clarity. "At this stage, all related financial activity will be frozen pending full audit. No further execution of this agreement will take place until every transaction is verified and traced." The words settled across the room like a firm closing line in a conversation no one had expected to end this way. William Carter exhaled slowly, then lowered himself into the nearest chair, not from weakness, but from the weight of recalibration. His eyes moved back to Ava again, studying her with a focus that had replaced every earlier assumption. "You were tracking this in real time," he said quietly. Ava nodded. "Not everything. Only what changed when everyone thought nothing was moving." Daniel Mercer finally turned his head slightly toward her. His voice was controlled, but thinner than before. "Why would you be monitoring corporate routing systems?" he asked. Ava met his gaze directly. "Because I was told not to ignore patterns that repeat when people are distracted." The answer did not satisfy him, and it was not meant to. Agent Collins stepped closer to the table, placing a second document down. There is also the matter of intent indicators, he said. Communication logs suggest premeditated structuring of the acquisition to appear legitimate while redirecting final control externally. A soft murmur passed through the board members again, but this time no one attempted to interrupt. William Carter leaned forward slightly, his hands now resting together. "How long has this been active?" he asked. Agent Collins checked the file briefly. "Based on current reconstruction, approximately 3 weeks." That number changed the tone in the room more than anything else had. 3 weeks meant planning, coordination, and confidence in execution. It meant the outcome had been designed long before today's meeting had even been scheduled. William Carter looked down at the table, then slowly back up at Daniel Mercer. "You told me this was a standard expansion partnership," he said, his voice quieter now, not accusing, but measuring. Daniel Mercer gave a short, restrained nod. "It was structured that way to ensure efficiency," he replied. Ava took a small step forward again, not interrupting, but aligning herself with the center of attention naturally. "Efficiency is what they call it when people are not supposed to notice what is being moved," she said. No one responded immediately. The phrase hung in the space between them, simple but precise. Agent Collins glanced at Ava again, then at William. "We will need full cooperation from your internal systems team," he said. William nodded once. "They will comply," he replied. Then, after a pause, he added, "Everything will comply now." The room did not react to the words, but they marked a shift. It was no longer about interruption. It was about consequence already in motion. Daniel Mercer adjusted his stance slightly, as if preparing to speak again, but stopped when he noticed 2 additional agents entering quietly behind the first group. The presence was subtle, but final. Ava watched this without expression. Her focus was no longer on who was being removed or questioned. It was on something else entirely, something that had already completed its function. William Carter followed her gaze briefly. "You said you saw this before it happened," he said. Ava nodded again. "Not before. While it was happening. There is a difference." William considered that for a moment, then leaned back slightly in his chair. "And you chose to step in anyway," he said. Ava looked at him directly. "Because if I did not, no one else would have done it in time." A long silence followed. It was not tense anymore. It was reflective. Outside, the city light shifted across the glass walls as clouds moved slowly over Manhattan, changing the brightness inside the room without anyone noticing at first. Agent Collins signaled toward his team, who began moving with quiet coordination toward Daniel Mercer. There was no sudden movement, no raised voices, only the controlled finality of procedure. Daniel did not resist. He simply exhaled, as if acknowledging a calculation that had resolved against him. As he was escorted away, his eyes briefly met William's, but William did not return the look. His attention remained on the table, where the contract still lay untouched, the pen still resting beside it, unchanged but now irrelevant. Ava turned slightly, watching the process without emotion, then slowly looked back toward William. "It is not over yet," she said softly. William looked at her. "No," he agreed. "But it is no longer what it was supposed to be." For the first time since the beginning of the meeting, the room felt still in a different way. Not frozen in tension, but released from it. The systems around them continued to process, investigate, and adjust, but the core moment had already passed. And in the quiet that followed, it became clear that the smallest presence in the room had not interrupted the outcome. She had simply revealed that it had already been decided long before anyone believed it was being made. The silence that followed Daniel Mercer's removal did not feel like an ending, but rather like a space that had been cleared for something more precise to begin forming. Inside the conference room of Carter Tower, the remaining executives stayed seated, but their posture had changed completely, no longer leaning into confidence or assumption, but into observation. William Carter remained at the table, his attention no longer on the contract or the agents who had already begun their procedural work, but on the quiet presence of Ava Johnson standing a few feet away from him. She had not moved much since the events unfolded, yet somehow the room felt increasingly oriented around her position, as if her stillness carried more direction than movement ever could. Agent Mark Collins stood near the far end of the table, speaking softly into a communication device, coordinating updates with his team outside the room. The legal folder remained open, but untouched, its contents now secondary to the shift that had already occurred. William finally broke his silence, turning slightly toward Ava. "You understood something before anyone else did," he said. Ava looked up at him briefly, then replied with the same calm clarity she had maintained since the beginning. "I understood that people rarely hide everything at once. They hide it in steps that look normal until they are not." William considered her words without interrupting, as if evaluating them against years of experience that had never accounted for this kind of interpretation coming from someone so young. One of the board members cleared his throat gently. "Mr. Carter," he said carefully, "what does this mean for the company moving forward?" William did not answer immediately. His eyes shifted toward the glass wall overlooking Manhattan, where the afternoon light had begun to soften, casting long reflections across the polished surfaces inside the room. "It means we stop assuming control is the same as understanding," he said at last. The words were not directed at any single person, but they settled into the space with quiet weight. Agent Collins stepped forward slightly. "There will be a full audit process initiated immediately," he said. "All executive access will be temporarily restricted until verification is complete." There was no resistance from the remaining executives. The reality of the situation had already replaced speculation. Ava remained still, listening but not reacting, as if the procedural aspects were no longer what mattered most. William turned back to her again. "You did not just see numbers," he said. "You saw intention." Ava nodded once. "Numbers are only language. Intention is what speaks through them when people are not careful." A brief pause followed. The kind of pause that does not come from uncertainty, but from recalibration. William leaned back slightly in his chair, his hands resting loosely together. "Where did you learn to think like this?" he asked. Ava hesitated for the first time since the beginning of the encounter. Her eyes shifted briefly toward the floor before returning to him. "I did not learn it in one place," she said. "I learned it by noticing what changes when adults stop paying attention." Agent Collins, who had been reviewing his tablet, looked up at this exchange but did not interrupt. Instead, he gestured subtly toward one of his colleagues, who exited the room quietly to continue coordination elsewhere. The room itself felt less like a corporate boardroom now and more like a transition point between two states of awareness. William stood slowly from his chair, moving a few steps closer to Ava. "You could have ignored this," he said. Ava met his gaze directly. "Yes," she replied, "but ignoring it would not have made it disappear." That answer lingered longer than expected. William studied her for a moment, then glanced briefly at the remaining executives. "Everything we thought we were signing today was already decided without us," he said, not as a question, but as recognition. No one contradicted him. The confirmation was already present in the silence that followed. Agent Collins closed the folder completely, signaling a procedural conclusion to this phase of the response. "We will continue monitoring all linked entities," he said. "For now, this room is secure." As he spoke, the atmosphere subtly shifted again, not toward tension, but toward stabilization. The crisis had not escalated into chaos. It had resolved into structure. Ava adjusted the strap of her backpack slightly, as if preparing to leave, but did not move yet. William noticed this and spoke again. "Where will you go now?" he asked. Ava paused for a moment before answering. "Home," she said simply. The word carried no additional explanation, yet it felt complete in its delivery. William nodded slowly, as if acknowledging something he had not fully considered until that moment. "You stopped something that most people would have missed entirely," he said. Ava looked at him for a brief second, then replied, "Most people are not supposed to see what is designed to be missed." A faint silence followed this, not uncomfortable, but reflective. Outside the glass walls, the city continued its constant motion, unaware of the recalibration that had just occurred above it. Agent Collins approached slightly, indicating that the formal procedures were transitioning to the next stage. William remained standing for a moment longer, then turned slightly toward Ava. "If you ever decide that you want to understand systems like this more deeply," he said, choosing his words carefully, "there will be space for you to do that." Ava did not respond immediately. She simply nodded once, not in agreement or acceptance, but in acknowledgement of possibility. And in that brief exchange, the room that had begun as a transaction point, then became a disruption point, had now settled into something else entirely, a recognition point where understanding no longer belonged to age, position, or expectation, but to perception itself. The moment Ava Johnson stepped away from the glass walls of Carter Tower, the entire atmosphere inside the building felt subtly different, as if the weight of what had just happened remained suspended in the air even after the formal procedures had begun to move forward. Outside the conference room, the hallway was quieter, lit by soft afternoon light reflecting off polished stone floors. William Carter walked a few steps behind her, not rushing, not leading, but simply following the natural rhythm of a moment that no longer belonged to contracts or corporations. Agent Mark Collins had already moved ahead with his team, coordinating final procedural steps with calm efficiency, leaving behind a space that felt temporarily unclaimed by authority. Ava stopped near a large window overlooking Manhattan, where traffic moved like distant streams beneath the elevated skyline. She looked outward without urgency, her expression thoughtful rather than emotional. William approached slowly and stopped beside her, maintaining a respectful distance. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was the kind that forms when understanding begins to replace confusion. Finally, William spoke in a lower tone. "You did not hesitate when everything in that room changed," he said. Ava kept her eyes on the city below. "Hesitation is usually what gives the situation time to become something worse," she replied. William nodded slightly, as if acknowledging a principle he had not previously considered in that exact form. "Most people would not have known where to look," he said. Ava turned her head slightly toward him. "Most people are not expected to," she said. A faint pause followed. Then William gestured gently toward the corridor ahead. "They will finish their review process inside," he said. "You do not need to stay for that part." Ava nodded, adjusting the strap of her backpack again, preparing to leave. As they began walking side by side down the corridor, the sound of their steps was soft against the polished floor, blending with the distant hum of the building's systems returning to normal operational rhythm. William glanced at her briefly. "Do you always notice things like that?" he asked. Ava thought for a moment before answering. "Not always," she said. "Only when something feels like it changes without explanation." William gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "That is a rare way to think," he said. Ava did not respond immediately. Instead, she looked ahead, focusing on the long corridor that stretched toward the elevator bank. "It is not rare," she said after a moment. "It is just not encouraged." The words remained between them as they continued walking. At the elevator doors, William pressed the button, and the soft chime signaled its arrival moments later. When the doors opened, a quiet reflection of both of them appeared in the polished interior surface. Ava stepped inside first, then turned slightly to face him. William hesitated before speaking again. "What happens when you are not in a place where people listen?" he asked. Ava considered the question with calm attention. "Then I make sure I am not speaking to be heard," she said. "I speak so that it exists." The elevator doors began to close slowly, and William remained standing outside, watching her as the space between them narrowed. "You are not invisible," he said quietly before the doors fully shut. Ava's expression did not change, but she gave a small nod, acknowledging the words without attaching weight to them. As the elevator descended, William remained still for a moment longer, then turned away, his attention shifting back toward the upper floors where the remaining procedures were still unfolding. Down in the lobby, the energy of the building had already begun to normalize, employees moving with cautious awareness of recent events but returning gradually to routine motion. Ava exited the elevator moments later, stepping into the open space of the lobby where natural light poured through the tall glass entrance. She walked toward the revolving doors at a steady pace, her small figure moving through a space designed for people far larger in authority and presence, yet drawing no attention that felt out of place anymore. Outside, the city air was cooler, carrying the steady rhythm of New York afternoon movement. Traffic flowed in measured patterns, pedestrians crossing intersections with the quiet urgency of daily life. Ava paused just outside the building for a brief moment, looking up at the height of Carter Tower. High above, behind layers of glass and steel, decisions were still being finalized, systems were still being adjusted, but the core shift had already occurred. She adjusted her backpack once more and began walking down the sidewalk, blending into the movement of the city. Inside the building, William Carter returned to the conference level where Agent Mark Collins was receiving final confirmation reports. The formal tone of the room had returned, but the underlying perception had changed permanently. William looked once more toward the empty chair where Ava had stood earlier. "She changed the way that room ended," he said quietly. Agent Collins nodded. "She identified what was already in motion before it reached completion," he replied. William exhaled slowly, then turned away from the table. "No," he said after a moment. "She changed what I thought motion even looked like." And with that, the room continued its work, but not in the same way it had begun. The afternoon outside Carter Tower had shifted into a slower rhythm as Ava Johnson continued walking along the wide Manhattan sidewalk, blending into the steady flow of people who had no idea that something significant had just concluded above them in a glass-walled room. The city sounded the same as always, taxis braking at intersections, distant construction echoing between buildings, the low hum of conversation drifting through the air. Yet Ava moved through it with a quiet awareness that nothing around her had remained unchanged in the way it had been before she entered that tower. Behind her, high above street level, William Carter stood once again inside the conference space, now partially cleared as Agent Mark Collins finalized documentation with his team. The contract that had once defined the entire meeting lay sealed in procedural evidence folders, no longer an object of ambition but of investigation. William's gaze lingered on the empty space where Ava had stood earlier, her presence still sharply defined in his memory more than any financial projection or executive briefing he had ever reviewed. One of his senior advisors approached cautiously, asking for direction regarding next steps with external partners, but William only raised a hand slightly, signaling for a moment of pause. His attention was not on operational recovery, but on recalibration of understanding. "We proceed carefully," he said finally, his voice measured but distant, as if he was speaking from a slightly different version of himself than the one who had entered the meeting hours earlier. Meanwhile, Ava continued forward several blocks, passing storefronts, street vendors, and office workers transitioning between the structured and unstructured parts of their day. She adjusted her backpack strap once, then slowed near a corner where the sound of traffic softened slightly beneath an overpass. There was no urgency in her movement, only continuity, as though everything she had done inside Carter Tower had not interrupted her life, but simply aligned with a pattern she already understood. Inside the tower, Agent Mark Collins concluded the final instructions with his team and closed his folder with a firm but controlled motion. "All parties involved will be processed through standard federal review channels," he stated, his tone professional but no longer urgent. The situation had transitioned from active response to structured resolution. William nodded once, absorbing the confirmation without visible reaction. After a brief pause, he stepped away from the table and moved toward the glass wall overlooking the city. From that height, the streets appeared like interconnected pathways of constant motion, unaware of the invisible decisions that occasionally shifted their direction. He thought back to Ava's words, not as isolated statements, but as a sequence that had revealed itself over time. Patterns that repeat when people are not paying attention, systems that move when no one is watching, truths that exist even when ignored. A quiet realization settled in him, not dramatic, but steady. The difference between control and awareness was not scale. It was perception. On the street below, Ava stopped briefly near a small public seating area, where a few people were gathered, each absorbed in their own devices or conversations. She sat down for a moment, not because she was tired, but because the rhythm of the city allowed pause without disruption. Across the street, a news van had begun to arrive near Carter Tower, though the story was still forming, still being translated into something the public would eventually recognize in simplified terms. Ava did not look back at the building. What had happened there no longer required her attention to remain real. Inside the tower, William finally stepped away from the window and returned to the center of the conference room, where only a few executives and Agent Collins remained. The environment was no longer tense, but reorganized. "We will need to reassess how decisions are validated moving forward," William said, more to himself than to anyone in particular. Agent Collins responded with a slight nod. "That is already underway," he said. As the formal conversation continued in lower tones, William's attention drifted again, not outward this time, but inward. He recognized that nothing about the structure of his company had collapsed, yet something foundational had shifted in how he interpreted it. A system he had trusted to be self-correcting had only been corrected because someone outside its expectations had recognized what it failed to prioritize. Outside, Ava stood once more and continued walking, now entering a quieter side street where the noise of the main avenue softened. The sunlight reflected off the glass surfaces of nearby buildings, creating shifting patterns on the pavement ahead of her. She did not look at them for long. Her focus remained forward, steady, unaffected by the scale of what had occurred behind her. Back at Carter Tower, William Carter signed a temporary procedural authorization document, not for approval of anything new, but to stabilize what had already been disrupted. As he set the pen down, he paused briefly, then spoke without turning to anyone in particular. "Find out where she goes to school," he said calmly. There was no further explanation needed. Agent Collins, who had just re-entered the room, simply replied, "We will locate the information through appropriate channels." William nodded once, then turned away from the table again, his thoughts no longer anchored to the structure of the deal that had brought them all together, but to the unexpected clarity that had emerged in its collapse. Outside, Ava Johnson disappeared gradually into the rhythm of the city, not as someone leaving behind an event, but as someone whose presence had already completed its purpose within it. The city continued moving in its usual rhythm as William Carter remained inside the upper floors of Carter Tower, but his attention no longer stayed within the boundaries of corporate procedure or financial recovery. The documents had been secured, the federal response had transitioned into standard review, and the immediate urgency that had filled the building earlier had faded into structured calm, yet something unresolved remained present in his thoughts. It was not about the contract anymore, nor about the system that had been exposed, but about the small presence that had shifted the outcome without force, without authority, and without hesitation. Later that afternoon, William stood alone in his office overlooking Manhattan, reviewing internal reports that summarized the events in clean, neutral language. Every sentence reduced complexity into procedural clarity, but none of it captured the moment itself, the instant where perception had overtaken assumption. He set the report down and leaned slightly toward the glass, looking down at the streets below. Somewhere in that movement of people, Ava Johnson had disappeared into the flow of the city, not as someone escaping, but as someone continuing. After a long pause, William reached for his phone and made a simple request to his assistant. "Find her school," he said again, this time more definite, as if the decision had moved from curiosity to intention. The response came within minutes. A public charter school located in Brooklyn, modest in structure, consistent attendance records, no unusual academic flags. Only one repeated note of observation. Exceptional analytical awareness in problem-solving situations. William read the line twice without speaking. The following morning, instead of arriving at scheduled executive meetings, he adjusted his calendar and left the tower earlier than usual. There was no announcement, no entourage beyond a single driver, and no destination shared beyond a simple address in Brooklyn. The drive took just over 40 minutes, moving from the dense verticality of Manhattan into lower, more grounded streets where buildings were smaller, sounds more direct, and movement less filtered by glass and steel. When the car stopped outside the school, William remained seated for a moment, looking through the window at a place that carried no corporate identity, no financial projection, only daily routine. Children were arriving through the gates, some running, some walking slowly, some holding conversations that had nothing to do with systems or structures. He stepped out quietly, adjusting nothing, not because he was trying to blend in, but because there was nothing to adjust for this environment. Inside the school courtyard, Ava Johnson was standing near a group of students, holding a notebook, listening rather than speaking. She looked the same as she had in the conference room, but now the context around her had changed completely. There were no executives, no screens, no legal documents, only a normal morning environment that did not recognize her as anything other than a student. When she noticed William, her expression did not change immediately, as if she was processing the transition between two realities that did not usually meet. He approached slowly, stopping a few feet away, ensuring distance that respected the space around her world. "I was told I could find you here," he said simply. Ava closed her notebook and looked at him directly. "This is where I am when I am not somewhere else," she replied. William nodded slightly, absorbing the simplicity of the statement. Around them, the courtyard continued its normal rhythm, students moving between conversations and classrooms, unaware of the significance projected onto this quiet exchange. "I wanted to understand something," William said after a moment. Ava tilted her head slightly, waiting without urgency. "How did you learn to see patterns that even experienced teams missed?" he asked. Ava thought for a brief moment before answering. "I do not think I see more than others," she said. "I just do not assume things are stable when I have not confirmed they are." William considered her words carefully, recognizing that what had appeared as extraordinary insight was, in her explanation, something much simpler and more consistent. "Most people would not have stopped that agreement in time," he said. Ava glanced briefly toward the school building, then back at him. "Most people are not in a position where stopping it is their responsibility," she replied. The answer was neither defensive nor proud. It was observational. A teacher walked past in the background, greeting students as the morning bell prepared to signal the start of classes. The normality of the environment contrasted sharply with everything William had experienced in the tower, yet it was here that the origin of that disruption now stood. He looked at her for a longer moment, not as a subject of curiosity, but as a point of reflection. "What happens when people start listening to you more often?" he asked. Ava shrugged slightly, not in indifference, but in acceptance of uncertainty. "Then I just make sure I am still saying what is true," she said. William nodded slowly, as if confirming something internal rather than external. There was a brief silence between them, not uncomfortable, but complete in its own way. Then he spoke again. "If you ever find yourself in a situation where what you see does not have a place to go," he said carefully, "you can reach out." Ava looked at him for a moment, then gave a small nod, acknowledging the statement without assigning expectation to it. The bell in the distance rang softly, signaling the transition into the school day. Students began moving toward their classrooms in organized flow. Ava adjusted her notebook, preparing to leave the courtyard space. Before she turned, she paused briefly and said, "Sometimes things only change because someone small enough to ignore it decided not to." William did not respond immediately. The sentence remained in the air between them as she walked away toward the building, joining the movement of students entering their day. He stayed where he was for a moment longer, watching until she disappeared inside. Then he turned slightly and looked back toward the street beyond the school gates. The city beyond continued its own motion, unchanged on the surface, but for William Carter, something fundamental in how he interpreted that motion had already shifted. It was not that the systems around him were different. It was that he now understood they had always depended on what people chose not to notice. The afternoon light in Brooklyn had begun to soften into a warmer tone as William Carter's car slowly pulled away from the school gates, leaving behind a quiet that felt noticeably different from the structured silence of his tower office. He remained seated in the back for a moment longer than necessary, watching through the tinted window as students moved through the courtyard, unaware of the brief intersection that had just taken place between their ordinary morning and a world far removed from it. The driver waited without speaking, understanding that William Carter was not yet ready to transition back into the rhythm of scheduled meetings and corporate decisions. Inside the vehicle, William finally leaned back, exhaling slowly as his thoughts settled into a pattern that had nothing to do with quarterly projections or executive risk assessments. It was not uncertainty that stayed with him now, but recognition. Recognition that systems did not fail suddenly. They shifted when attention moved elsewhere. Recognition that clarity often arrived from places that were never designed to be consulted. Meanwhile, inside the school building, Ava Johnson had already returned to her classroom, taking her seat near a window where natural light fell across her desk in steady angles. The lesson had already begun, but her attention remained briefly elsewhere, not distracted, but reflective, as if aligning what had happened in the past days with the structure of normal routine that now surrounded her again. Her teacher moved through the material with calm pacing, unaware of the larger narrative that had briefly intersected with this classroom's existence. Ava opened her notebook and wrote a single line before continuing with the assignment, not for emphasis, but for memory, as if recording a conclusion that did not require repetition. Outside the school, William's vehicle merged into traffic, moving back toward Manhattan. The city reappeared gradually in the distance, its skyline forming again as a familiar structure of glass and steel. Yet as the car approached the bridge, William found himself looking at it differently than before. What had once represented scale, efficiency, and control now carried a second layer of meaning that was harder to quantify. His phone buzzed intermittently with messages from his office, updates about finalized freezes, compliance confirmations, and procedural resolutions. He read none of them immediately. Instead, he allowed the silence between notifications to remain uninterrupted, as if giving space for thought to complete itself without interference. When he finally arrived back at Carter Tower, the building felt unchanged in appearance, yet internally it no longer matched the version he had left earlier that week. Elevators carried him upward with quiet efficiency, and employees greeted him with professional acknowledgement. But something subtle had shifted in how he moved through these interactions. He was no longer navigating outcomes. He was reviewing assumptions. In his office, William stood once again at the glass wall, overlooking Manhattan, the same vantage point where earlier decisions had been made under entirely different conditions. The city stretched outward in every direction, consistent and uninterrupted, yet his perception of it no longer aligned with the simplicity of continuity. Agent Mark Collins had already departed earlier that day, leaving behind formal documentation and finalized reports, but the imprint of the process remained in the space where structured authority had intersected with unexpected intervention. William placed a hand lightly on the edge of his desk and spoke quietly to himself, though there was no one present to respond. It was never about interruption, he said. It was about visibility. The words did not resolve anything immediately, but they reframed the sequence of events that had unfolded over the past day. A system had not been broken. It had been revealed. And what had revealed it had not been scale, influence, or authority, but observation without assumption. Across the city, Ava finished her school day without incident, moving through lessons, conversations, and transitions like any other student. Yet beneath the surface of routine, the events of earlier days remained present not as disruption, but as reference. When the final bell rang, she exited the building with the same calm pace she had maintained throughout the day, stepping into the afternoon light where parents, guardians, and students converged in predictable motion. There was no visible sign that her morning had intersected with corporate structures far beyond the scope of her environment. She adjusted her backpack and began walking home, following a familiar route through streets that had no awareness of the larger systems operating above them. Back in the tower, William remained at the window as daylight began to shift toward evening. His assistant entered briefly to deliver a final report, then left without interruption. William did not open the document immediately. Instead, he continued observing the city below, not as an owner of systems within it, but as someone recalibrating how those systems were understood. For the first time in a long time, he considered that awareness was not a product of access, but of attention. And somewhere in that realization, the presence of a small voice in a conference room earlier that week remained not as memory, but as a fixed point that had altered everything that followed. The evening had fully settled over Manhattan as Carter Tower reflected the last traces of daylight in long vertical bands of gold and gray. While inside the upper office, William Carter remained standing at the same glass wall, where he had spent most of the day processing what could no longer be classified as a standard corporate disruption. The city below continued its movement, uninterrupted and indifferent, yet his perception of it had changed in a way that no report or executive briefing could fully translate. The phone on his desk remained silent, no longer commanding urgency, only presence, as if the usual rhythm of his responsibilities had temporarily lost its authority over interpretation. He turned slightly away from the window and walked back toward his desk, where a single printed file still sat unopened among cleared documents. It was the background summary on Ava Johnson, delivered earlier that day by his assistant and left untouched until now. He picked it up without haste and began reading. The contents were simple on the surface: attendance records, academic performance notes, behavioral observations from teachers. Nothing in it reflected the precision she had demonstrated in the conference room, yet that contradiction no longer surprised him. It only confirmed what he was beginning to understand. Systems recorded what they were designed to measure, not what actually defined capability. As he reached the final page, William set the file down and leaned back slightly in his chair. For a long moment, he did not speak or move. The realization that had been forming across the past days had now settled into clarity without resistance. What had appeared as an anomaly was in fact a different form of intelligence operating outside expected frameworks. Meanwhile, across the city in Brooklyn, Ava Johnson had already returned home, placing her backpack near the entrance of a modest apartment where evening light filtered through partially drawn curtains. The environment was quiet, familiar, and unchanged by anything that had occurred earlier that week. Yet Ava stood for a moment in the center of the room before sitting down at a small table where a notebook and pencil rested. She opened the notebook and wrote a few lines, not as a report or reflection, but as continuity, as if preserving a sequence of thought that did not belong to a single moment. Outside her window, streetlights began to activate one by one, marking the transition from day to evening in steady progression. In Manhattan, William Carter finally closed the file and placed it back on his desk, then stood once again at the glass wall overlooking the city. This time, his attention was not focused on scale or structure, but on distribution of awareness. He recognized that the events of the past days had not introduced new information into his world. They had revealed information that had always been present but never prioritized. His phone buzzed once more with a message from his office confirming full stabilization of all corporate systems and closure of investigative review cycles. He read it briefly, then set the phone down without response. The resolution had already taken place in a different layer of understanding. Later that evening, William left the tower without announcement, descending through the elevator alone. The lobby was quieter than earlier in the day, with reduced foot traffic and softened lighting. Outside, the temperature had dropped slightly, and the city carried a slower rhythm as nighttime approached. He did not call for his driver immediately. Instead, he stood for a moment at the entrance of the building, looking upward rather than outward. The structure that had defined so much of his professional life now felt less like a symbol of control and more like a system dependent on continuous interpretation. He began walking slowly along the sidewalk, moving without destination for several blocks, blending into the flow of pedestrians who were unaware of his identity or the significance of the week that had just passed. Meanwhile, Ava finished writing in her notebook, closed it gently, and turned off the small lamp beside her. The apartment remained quiet, with only the ambient sounds of the city passing through the walls. She sat for a moment without movement, then stood and placed the notebook on a shelf beside others that contained similar observations, thoughts, and structured reflections. There was no indication of finality in her actions, only continuation. Back in Manhattan, William eventually stopped near a bridge overlooking the river, where the city lights reflected across the water in slow, shifting patterns. He rested his hands lightly on the railing and observed the movement below. For the first time in a long while, he did not evaluate what he saw in terms of performance or outcome. Instead, he observed it as layered activity, each movement existing independently, yet contributing to a larger structure that was not controlled from a single point. The memory of Ava Johnson's presence in his office returned not as disruption, but as reference, a fixed marker against which his understanding of decision-making had quietly reorganized itself. And in that realization, there was no conclusion, only recognition that the systems he once believed were defined by authority were in fact defined by attention, and attention, once shifted, changed everything without ever breaking it.